Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar. Does China's influence diminish in a multipolar world? As the world undergoes seismic geopolitical shifts, the era of American dominance is drawing to a close. Other major powers will vie for influence in this emerging multipolar scenario, most notably China. But how will such change impact China? Can it navigate and shape a global landscape increasingly influenced by multiple powerful actors? What alliances might Beijing forge around its spheres of influence, especially with smaller nations who leverage their resources to compete? And is China's influence likely to diminish, grow, or simply adapt in a new multipolar order? To consider these and related questions, please stay tuned for our live discussion, bringing your comments and questions for our expert panel.
Hello, I'm Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next 90 minutes for this Democracy Forum debate on an issue much talked about in strategic and diplomatic circles. But do we have any idea of what multipolar, this new fashion icon of geopolitics, really means? Our debate: does China's influence diminish in a multipolar world? And where does that leave the concept of only a few years ago that influence would revolve around two competing powers, the United States and China, that G2? The waning of the West has been much debated, but how much might China influence diminish or increase in this multipolar world? To unpack these questions, we are privileged to have a superb panel: Kerry Brown, James Crabtree, Sophie Wushuang and Mher Sahakyan. But before I go to them, I will ask Lord Charles Bruce, President of the Democracy Forum, to lay out the background and canvas of our debate. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar. Our focus is the great power competition between China and the United States, a contest we have dissected on many occasions in recent years. But today, we've asked our panelists to view the rivalry through the perspective of a multipolar world. And I'm keenly looking forward to their contributions and to the discussion to follow. I'm very grateful to the team at Democracy Forum for arranging this event and for inviting such an eminent group of speakers. And my thanks, as always, to Humphrey Hawksley for agreeing to act as moderator. Writing last year for Foreign Policy, the China analyst Joinge Beckfold suggests, I quote, "It's simply a myth that today's world is anywhere close to multipolar. Instead," he concludes, "there are only two countries with the economic size, military might, and global leverage to constitute a pole: the United States and China." But Chinese foreign policy is pursuing different goals to the United States, opening up an entirely different perspective of how to engage with a multipolar world. Whereas America has entered collective defense agreements with 56 countries and provides military aid to other countries such as Israel and Ukraine, China has only one such agreement with North Korea. Instead, China has become the world's most prolific trading partner, achieving higher volumes of trade than the United States with over 120 countries. And China has also become the world's largest creditor nation, having invested more than $1 trillion in the infrastructure of more than 140 countries. As Gideon Rachman writes for the Financial Times, I quote, "For developing countries seeking to make rapid economic progress, the Chinese offer remains more attractive." And testifying to the United States Congress Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party in May this year, a former United States official said, I quote, "From project identification to signing, commencing, and completing, China is much faster and cheaper than the United States at virtually every stage." But China's gargantuan appetite for international development is now subject to increasing review and revision. Over 1,700 Belt and Road initiatives worth around $450 billion have been labeled as problem projects. And around 80% of China's current overseas lending portfolio is actually supporting debtor countries in distress. A reputation built up as a credible and supported development partner has taken a serious knock. China's public approval rating in the developing world have plunged from 56% to less than 40%. As a consequence of poor project implementation, the rising costs of debt, and the unethical methods deployed to reduce its lending risks. It is rapidly earning the unfortunate moniker as the world's large debt collector. In order to allay the fears of the global south of being swamped with cheap Chinese goods, President Xi took the opportunity of the China-Africa summit held in Beijing in September to pledge a zero tariff regime for the world's least developed countries. But many seasoned observers could not conceal their skepticism. I quote, "China's move to allow African, less developed countries to export tariff-free is clearly a move to project its power in an alternative world order," said Samir Bhattacharya at the New Delhi-based Observer Research Foundation. He added, "China has reworked its trade basket to lure African leaders." But the truth is that China's increasing reliance on an export-heavy economic model threatens the very trading relationships that underpin its multipolar ambitions, and crucially, its attempt to compete with Washington for influence in Africa and Asia. I quote, "Protectionism against the low-cost Chinese imports has so far been a Western phenomenon, with Asia largely a bystander. This is about to change," suggests an article published by the Asian investment bank Nomura in July, which contains a stiff warning for China now facing the inevitable protectionist domino effect across many countries. Well, thank you very much for choosing to watch this webinar today. And if you have any comments or questions, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. China's gargantuan appetite, subject to increasing review and revision. Our first panelist is Professor Kerry Brown, Director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London, a former diplomat in Beijing. His latest books include The Great Reversal, Britain, China, and the 400-Year Contest for Power, and The Taiwan Story, How a Small Island Will Dictate the Global Future. He knows his stuff. So are we shifting into a multipolar world? What does it mean? And how would that impact the rise of China? Kerry Brown, tell us what you know.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's good to be back here. And thank you for that generous introduction, Humphrey. China can be said in some ways to have been an early supporter of multipolarity. The United Nations, when Deng Xiaoping re-emerged from some years under a cloud during the Cultural Revolution in, I think it was 1974, he went to New York and supported this idea of there being three worlds, the three-world theory, which was from Mao Zedong, about the first world, America, its alliances, the second world, the USSR and its alliances, as were, and then the non-aligned world. And that went back to the 1950s and the Bandung Conference, the idea that there were these kind of big group of countries with India, China, and many others who had been emerging from colonization and who therefore didn't have the kind of alignments either from treaties or necessarily from any other arrangements. They lived in a kind of more, I suppose, flexible world. And I guess today we therefore see that becoming probably true, as Lord Bruce said in his introduction. China does, through the Belt and Road Initiative, maybe less intensely now than it did recently, but it still subscribes to offering economic and aid arrangements to a vast array of global South countries, building up multilateral fora like the Forum on Africa and China, which met in September, which I think is 54 countries. And also the Latin America. There's a fora there for China and Latin American countries and for the Middle East. And China seems to have relationships which are not alliance-based. They're not based on treaties. They're strategic partnerships, as it calls them, some of them comprehensive, some of them just strategic partnerships, and they're based on an idea of transaction and reciprocity. And I suppose with those two words, transaction and reciprocity, we're sort of coming to this weird alignment as we move into the Trump era in the United States from next January. And China, we get a geopolitics which is sort of being stripped of its values and based on interest, self-interest, a kind of Hobbesian anarchy, which we are saved from by all sorts of countries, never whether they're big or small, having some idea of what their self-interest is and building all of their relationships with others on the basis of that. I mean, a multipolarity of kind of self-interest where somehow there is enough common ground. Some of those issues like environmentalism, AI, maybe even nuclear proliferation, the self-interest is to avoid complete destruction, so people will cooperate. But some of them, it is really more about intense cooperation and, in fact, competition. Does this multipolar world offer China opportunities which it will inevitably win? I think that's really what the essence of this, kind of question is, or is it actually going to find it tough in that kind of world? Well, I think my argument today would be that China is an opportunist power. It seeks opportunities, but it also likes to avoid responsibilities. Were it a power with a kind of vision of its holistic kind of power assets, its desire to have deep links in terms of values and a common worldview with others, where it was trying to promote a Chinese view of the world with the kinds of political configuration it has at the moment, well, I think we would be facing a very different challenge. A China which was coming and saying to us, we know how things run better than you, and you should adopt parts of our system, in fact, maybe all of our system. Well, that would be really a kind of cultural clash, a civilizational clash sort of world. We would have America and China as the big powers offering very alternative worldviews, and we would, as middle powers, most of us, need to kind of choose how to navigate those great poles. I don't think China really is offering that, though. I mean, it's making life a little more difficult for us, because what it's kind of saying is that there should be a structure of cooperation, a loose structure of cooperation, a kind of architecture of, sort of multipolarity, not necessarily through the UN. Maybe the UN isn't really functioning very well anymore, but through different kinds of levels and hierarchies of engagement in different sectors and different areas. And sure, we can work with that, but we don't have to kind of agree with any big explanatory framework for this and any kind of ends-directed rationale for it. We work in a process, and as long as the process works okay, where we decide all of this has to be directed to and end up, that's our business separately as nation states and actors within that system. China's liking of process rather than the kind of directed ends. This is a philosophical issue, and there are very good writers on Chinese thinking that talk often of this idea of, a kind of philosophical tradition from the Warring States onwards of more about process and going through things and the flow of things rather than having to have defined objectives and getting to some endpoint like the Enlightenment project under Kant's original definition, where we can say, yay, we've got to the perpetual peace. For China, that isn't what we are up to. We're up to something much more fluid and imprecise. I think in that kind of world, whether China's power diminishes or grows, it really depends on a number of variables, the most important of which is the very prosaic one of the economy. I mean, China's economy at the moment, it once was its greatest asset. That was really what the Belt and Road was built on, the idea of China being a significant global economy that offered things and capacities and finance and other things that powers like the United States didn't. But at the moment, the Chinese economy is going through a great deal of stress, as all the rest of us. And therefore, we are rethinking how this economic multipolarity really works and what China's role in that will be. There is going to be give and take. I mean, it's the economy after all. There's going to be ways in which China will need to allow access to its finance and services sector in ways in which Europeans might or might not get benefit, Americans might or might not get benefit. And remember that in the end, Mr. Trump is looking for a big deal, and it is perfectly possible that in his time in government from January, he may well surprise us all by having a great big deal with China that allows those sorts of accesses and addresses the kinds of imbalances that he is most fixated on. So it really is hard to say whether China is going to grow or diminish as a result of this economic kind of process. But I guess the thing that is attached to that is in terms of its geopolitical or diplomatic role. As I said, China is an opportunist. In theory, therefore, it could grasp the opportunities offered in the parlous issues with the Russian war on Ukraine, with the situation in the Middle East, with Israel and Gaza, with what's just happened in Syria, with all of these issues. China has capacity, military ability, and some interest in these areas to take a bigger role. The question, though, is will it do that? After all, it has been very hesitant. For all of our berating it about its non-covert help for Russia, its diplomatic support for Russia in the war on Ukraine, China has done as much as it can to sit on the wall and not really wade into this too much. I think secretly it might have real double thoughts about what it regards as its interest in this issue. I suspect one of its big interests will be reconstruction of Ukraine when this awful conflict is over. The same for the Middle East. China is a big this is a big source of energy for the Middle East. This is for China, Saudi Arabia, Iran. They're big economic partners for China in this respect, and therefore it does not want instability. And yet we see at the moment that it is also extremely reluctant to wade in and to do anything more than just tell people to stop fighting. That's a very laudable thing, but as we all know, the pathway in order to do that is the really tough thing, and there China has a much less vocal role. So I am extremely skeptical about whether China is able to take a bigger diplomatic role, even if it was possible and we wanted it to. I suspect, in answer to the question, just to conclude, that China's influence will probably be more important in the years ahead as the world grows more complex, and as we track the ways in which, if it happens, Chinese GDP and American GDP and the GDP of others like India, who are important players, kind of come to more sort of parity. We're living in a world with a bit of a tipping point at the moment. Chinese GDP is about 2/3 that of the United States. There are predictions that it could overtake the United States. This is just on gross GDP rather than purchasing parity. I mean, there's possibilities of India with its relatively high growth rate growing more and more important. So we have a tripolar situation economically. And I think that's going to be really decisive, because the moment in which China does perhaps become, in terms of gross GDP, the world's biggest power, we cross a definite line in which we would expect as the biggest economy, it therefore has a bigger role. And it would be strange if it didn't. The question is what sort of role that is. The very final thing I'll say is that multipolarity is really about a complex form of consensus. I mean, if you have a kind of multipolar system, you've got to have at least a shared set of rules. And that doesn't matter who is the most dominant partner in that. It matters how people recognize their common interest. One of the weird things at the moment is, in fact, at least under the current White House, between China and the United States and most others, as we've seen at the UN COP discussions, there's a lot of unity about what we think are our existential issues. China's role in the global system, I don't think, is an existential issue at all. How all countries deal with environmental issues, with AI, and with looming sustainability issues, those are, and those will guide multipolarity rather than what happens to Beijing or Washington. Thank you very much.
Kerry Brown, thank you very much for that. Your phrase "avoid responsibility," which has sort of led your argument there, is this the view that we've been getting from London or Washington, that China is a threat, that China wants to overthrow or reform a world order? Whereas, if I'm not mistaken, you're arguing that in a way China might be more comfortable in a multipolar world than the US is.
Yeah, I think if it's a multipolar world where it's based on transactions and reciprocity, and we don't talk too much about values and political values, China will be comfortable with that. I mean, it's suspicious of America coming along and saying, here, as this sort of great system, but you have to adopt this governance system to deliver that. I mean, China doesn't want that. And of course, the other way around, we don't like a global order in which China might be doing the same backwards. I personally am skeptical about whether China wants to promote a particularly thick set of values. I think the issue is not so much that, but that it's kind of wanting an amoral setup. I mean, and that's kind of what we're going to get with Trump. So it is a very strange period we're going to be moving into.
That's good. And can I put you a question that's coming from the audience that you have answered, but I'll read it out. And Antoma, are we really close to having a multipolar world today, given that only the United States and China truly have the economic and military power to form a global pole?
Well, those powers are very dependent. They're not self-sufficient powers, right? I mean, we're not in a kind of world, maybe with the United States in the 60s and the 70s, when it really, really was, or the 90s indeed, very, very dominant economically and, kind of really on its own. I think now we are, kind of, there's lots of codependence. The Chinese economy is deeply dependent still on foreign markets for manufacturing. And the US economy is still deeply dependent and will probably be more dependent on sources of technology. China is spending massive amounts on technology at the moment, and it will be producing things that we need in the future, most likely. I think it's going to be codependence, where actually all countries are going to need each other. That isn't a story that's likely to change.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Stick around, because we're going to come back and forth to you. Next, we go to James Crabtree, a distinguished visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and formerly head of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Singapore, host of the prestigious and annual Shangri-La Dialogue. He is the author of The Billionaire Raj, A Journey Through India's New Gilded Age, and is deeply knowledgeable about how Asian nations view multipolarity and China. Are we now in an Asia Gilded Age? James Crabtree, share your thoughts.
Thank you, Humphrey. Much appreciate the time. Nice to be here with Kerry and the other panelists. Let me say three things briefly, less about China, which is more Kerry's area, and more about how other countries are, or other entities in the international system are grappling with China's role and influence. The first of which is about the United States, where it seems to me that we're going to have a change strategy in Washington with dealing with China as an international actor. Under President Biden, particularly in Asia, you had a refocusing of US strategy with respect to China to try and spend a lot more time engaging with a narrower group of high-impact allies and partners. So that specifically means countries like Japan, Australia, India, and the Philippines, and less time spent with the larger number of wavering nations in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Not none, but I think in the Obama years, there was a sense in which in Washington that a lot of these countries were in play for the United States, as in China's behavior was viewed through American eyes so terrible and so unhelpful that other countries would come around to an American way of thinking eventually, simply because of the way that China behaved. And I think gradually the US has realized that that isn't what's going to happen, that if you're sitting in South Asia or Southeast Asia or the Pacific Islands, or the Middle East, most countries do not want to pick one side or another. They want to have relationships with both and get out of it what they can. And therefore the US changed tack and invested much more energy in building deeper partnerships with those countries that were most threatened by China, mostly the Quad countries and a few others. I think you'll see, in a sense, a doubling down of that under Trump, and less focus on kind of waverers in the global South. The US recognizes that it is no longer a kind of all-weather superpower. It has to focus its efforts. Its ability to do that has been imperfect. It hasn't, for instance, managed to extricate itself from the Middle East or Europe in order to focus on Asia. But I think the direction of travel of US foreign policy is pretty clear. And so under Trump, you'll see more of that, and how China chooses to cope with that is something perhaps that we can discuss. From a European perspective, I would only echo, in a sense, the point that was made by Lord Bruce at the start, which also echoes something that Kerry said, which is a lot of China's approach to the world is less a function of a sort of an ideological form of Marxist-Leninist statecraft and is more a reflection of whatever happens to be going on in the Chinese economy at that moment. So the Belt and Road Initiative, or whatever else it was a useful source of channeling spare capacity in Chinese infrastructure creation internationally in the 2010s. What you're seeing now, as Lord Bruce said, and as I have argued, is more of a challenge for China, that as its economic model pivots away from investment in domestic infrastructure and property and more towards advanced manufacturing, that does create some challenges with its own engagement, not just with the United States and Europe, which are busy erecting tariff barriers in one form or another on various types of Chinese goods. We can talk about the extent to which they're justified and why, if you want. But that's going to be equally problematic for middle-income countries in emerging Asia or Africa or Latin America, given the sheer size and scale of the Chinese economy. If China begins to move into an area that, for instance, Malaysia or Vietnam or Chile had been cost competitive in, then Malaysia or Vietnam or Chile will face the same problems that Germany or Britain or the United States face. And therefore, as China's economic model changes, which it has very rapidly in the aftermath of COVID, then that changes the nature of China's engagement with the rest of the world. I mean, that has already changed. The emphasis on the infrastructure component of the Belt and Road Initiative has diminished as China's willingness to throw good money after bad, and also its sort of surplus capital, both of those have diminished. And so it has then put more focus on technological diplomacy in areas like less artificial intelligence, more data centers and data parks and that kind of thing. The other thing I wanted to talk about was India and the way that India plays a role in this. I mean, in a sense, India and China have some similarities. They both believe in a multipolar world in one form or another. I mean, Samir Saran at the Observer Research Foundation had a rather neat formulation in which he said that the United States believes in a unipolar world and a multipolar Asia, and China believes in the opposite, a unipolar Asia and a multipolar world. He claimed India was the only one that believed in a multipolar Asia and a multipolar world. But India is clearly competing with China to be a voice for the global South, broadly conceived, and has its own reasons to not allow China to dominate the new and old international institutions as a voice for the new and emerging multipolar order. I mean, I think China has been quite clever in the way that it has used new and existing institutions to craft a role for itself. As Rohan Mukherjee's work at the London School of Economics shows, China, unlike Russia, it's not a simple story that sometimes you might get out of Washington of China having a destructive role in international systems. Actually, in many international institutions, China feels that it is reasonably well represented. It doesn't want to tear the institutions down. It simply wants to have a greater say within them, within the United Nations, for instance. And that's why China competes often quite fiercely to be a leader or to have its candidates lead these kind of institutions. But it has also sought to create new international institutions, and the decision a year or 2 years ago to begin to put much more energy into the BRICS, I think, is the most obvious example of that, which is now a Chinese-led institution in a way that perhaps it wasn't at the beginning. And there was a period of time in which I think China had lost interest in the BRICS. It didn't need the new development bank because it had the AIIB. And in general, the BRICS as a grouping, given that Brazil and South Africa were not terribly exciting international partners, and India was a complicated adversary for China. So the BRICS as an institution seemed to be bit of a dead end. But I think China looked at this and thought, actually, there is something we can do with this. We can create a new institution which will not involve the Western nations, and in which China can be a leader, and that was a bet worth playing. So I think the relationship that India and China will have within the existing institutions like the G20 and the new ones like the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization will be particularly interesting. I mean, where does China go in this? I think, as Kerry said, it's not exactly clear. China's economic model has changed, and that changes what it is able to do, as in it is no longer. It can no longer afford and no longer is in the business of just splashing cash on endless expensive big ports and rail projects. It's trying to use its international influence more selectively and strategically. But I think still you also have to understand that China primarily sees the world through the lens of geopolitical competition with the United States. And therefore, if you look at its support for Russia and Ukraine, or the way that it acts in the Middle East, I agree with Kerry that China often does not seek as large a role as you might expect in some of these international moments, as in China's role in the ongoing crisis in the Middle East at the moment has actually been pretty negligible. Occasionally, it will arrive to put its blessing on a piece of diplomatic architecture that has been essentially developed by others, as was true in the Saudi-Iran deal of a few years ago. But China has not really sought a leading role in the diplomacy over the Middle East or Ukraine. And in a sense, why would it? In a sense, these are extremely difficult, complicated situations. China didn't break it. It's not clear why China should be made to fix it. And so I can understand why China chooses to be quite selective in where it chooses to play these roles. So I think it will be particularly interesting to see how China, as it is primarily focused on understanding the nature of its new relationship with the United States in the Trump era, how it then chooses to use its kind of broader relations with other non-aligned parties, and indeed, groups like the Europeans, to try and manage its relationship with the US and gain leverage over the next couple of years. Humphrey, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. I just want to pick you up on one point, is how misleading or accurate are the top line stories that us people on the street are getting out of Washington, that China is a threat, that there's about to be war over Taiwan. This is this constant refrain that is coming out of some very established periodicals and newspapers and that. How misleading or accurate are they?
Well, I don't think anybody really knows. Ultimately, the decision to escalate in one form or another over Taiwan is going to come down effectively to the decision of Xi Jinping.
I think so, the point that I'm making is that the people on the streets' vision of what China is a new enemy. But what you and Kerry Brown have both said is far more nuanced than that. It wants to avoid responsibility, no need to fix what you haven't broken. This is a different sort of aspect, isn't it?
Well, no. I mean, I think Kerry and I may disagree on this. I'd be interested to hear what he said. I mean, I think China does want an entirely different balance of power in East Asia. The current situation, which is a legacy of the Second World War, in which the United States and its allies, effectively control the East Asian littoral, is not one that is acceptable to China, and Taiwan is part of that, but it's not the only part of that. I think,
and the reversal of that isn't acceptable to the United States.
Exactly, and so that's the central dilemma of our age, which is that China would very much like to push the United States much further away from its backyard, and to weaken the set of alliance relationships which it has, which it views, not entirely without reason, as being a form of constraint and containment. So in that sense, yes, I mean, China is a big threat to the existing world order, and the existing international order. So if you're the United States, then you can see why you see it that way. The question is more if and when will China act on this to either to take advantage of a crisis or to cause one of itself, or to resort to military as opposed to other forms of international activity. And that's what I mean when we say, well, we don't really know. I mean, the conventional wisdom, I think, is not very soon, because China doesn't perceive itself to be strong enough to act yet.
Okay, can I just bring Kerry back in here, because he did write, he's just written a book on Taiwan, as to whether you agree with that, Kerry? Kerry is muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think James is right. I mean, I don't want that ever to be muted. I want that to be known by everyone that James is right. I think China wants well, it makes sense. I mean, it makes geopolitical sense. If you're in Asia, in the region China is in, with a lot of insecurity around it, 14 very difficult neighbors, you would want to have some kind of power and dominance in that region. This is no big secret, and I think it's been looking for that for a long time. I think it's right. I think James is right. I mean, how that is achieved and whether America is happy with that, that's going to be the big issue.
And no immediate Taiwan threat. I mean, not tomorrow, not next year, not in the next decade.
Well, that depends on whether. Well, that depends on two things. One is whether the current president of Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, is going to be sensible. And the other is whether American politicians are going to be sensible, because once they get adventurous on this policy, we are into real danger territory. That was less likely in the past. Now it's more likely than it's ever been. Still not very likely, but still too likely to be comfortable.
Okay, thank you very much, Kerry. We must remember that the Vietnam War started with the Gulf of Tonkin, which was apparently a fabricated incident. Just one more question for you, James, from the audience, Chanda Bahadar. I'll read it to you. You have touched on it before. India and China recently completed disengagement at Depsang and Demchok, friction points along the line of actual control. Does this, along with New Delhi flexing its diplomatic muscles at the BRICS, SCO and Quad summits and a successful G20, point to India's role as a potential new superpower in the world order?
Yeah, I mean, I think in time, yes. I remember when I wrote my India book, Kishore Mahbubani, the Singaporean public intellectual, had a nice line in which he said that Narendra Modi and his election was the event that began the multipolar era. And that was because until Modi arrived, it wasn't really, India was punching below its weight and had a series of rather unimpressive governments mired in domestic problems. It was only when Modi arrived that India really began to have real clout on the international stage. And I think you've seen that increasing through the G20, which was in a sense a high watermark, and it will continue to increase as India's economy grows and its role in the international system grows. So, I mean, India doesn't style itself as a global power. It styles itself in the world, the words of Mr. Jaishankar, the foreign affairs minister, as a leading power, which means the leading power in South Asia, its own backyard, and one with an increasing role to play around the region. But I think if you look at the big diplomatic flashpoints of the coming couple of years, trying to find some diplomacy in the Middle East, potentially a big Israel-Saudi deal, a peace deal in Ukraine, India will play even less of a central role in those than China. It will around the edges and try and find a role for itself, which it can claim to be important, but still it will be the United States, which is the crucial actor in these ongoing issues, which I think is a reflection of what we'll see over the next couple of years under Trump, which is, the US remains the most important player in the international system. And when the US wants to throw its weight around, then everyone else is going to notice.
So that's fascinating. So we've got two powers that we've discussed, India and China, both, I guess, avoiding responsibility, as Kerry said. Thank you, James Crabtree, very much. Our third panelist is Dr. Sophie Wushuang, a colleague of Kerry Brown's from the Lau Institute, also connected with Tsinghua University in China and other academic institutions. Earlier this year, she published Shifting Tides of Power, The Evolution of China Naval Strategy in the South China Sea, from Defensive Offense to Defensive Defense, 1974 to 2018, and will share with us her knowledge of regional power dynamics. How will China's influence be reinforced or challenged? Sophie Wushuang, give us your argument.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for your kind introduction. I think we have kind of reached the consensus that we are seeing the emergence of multipolar world. But personally speaking, I think the real question isn't just about whether China's influence will diminish, but how it will navigate and adapt within this new landscape. So recent weeks have shown us how dynamic and unpredictable global politics can be, from the collapse of the crisis in Syria to South Korea's the president's declaration of martial law and the political turbulences in Philippines. It's evident that many nations are preoccupied with pressing domestic challenges, let alone the crisis happening right now in Gaza and Ukraine. So this development raises a critical question, I think. What role can China play in a world where countries are increasingly turned inward to address their domestic priorities? And as many of the previous panelists has already mentioned, China is also facing some significant challenges at home, slowing economic growth, high youth unemployment, and issues in its property market. These challenges put pressure on Beijing to maintain stability and economic resilience, which are critical to its domestic and international influence. And as China deals with these internal issues, it's going to impact on how it engages on the global stage. So if we record a meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden last month, Xi Jinping emphasized China's bottom lines to Biden, particularly the South China Sea and Taiwan as inseparable from China's sovereignty and national pride. He reaffirmed that China's preference for bilateral negotiations in the South China Sea, highlighted a desire to handle the disputes without external interference from Beijing's perspective. And from his speech, his approach shows that China wants to control its own narrative and manage its relationship in the region. So in particular, in the South China Sea, China's influence is significant, that's for sure, with a growing military presence and also naval power projection capabilities. But its power is also contested. The U.S. emphasizes freedom of navigation and strengthens its alliances to assert its presence in the region. The 2022 Tri-Service report published by the U.S. Naval Service, Advantage at Sea, calling China the threat to U.S. Navy's capability to maintain its advantage at sea. And the U.S. Meanwhile, China stresses these historical claims and supports them with military deployments. And more recently, we see the baseline demarcations surrounding the Scarborough Shoal. So countries like the Philippines and Vietnam are left alone to navigate their relationship, not only just with China, but also the U.S. And I think this showcases the complex dynamics at play that we are seeing today. And globally, I think a lot of the panelists have already touched on this. China is also trying to expand its influence through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS Plus. We're seeing the Argentina signing up to BRICS Plus, but withdrawing its application at the last minute. And also a lot of other cooperation that has been going on between China and the regional countries. A report from the Assoc Institute published early this year actually indicated that the result of China has edged past the US to become the prevailing choice by 50.5% if the ASEAN region were forced to align itself in the ongoing US-China rivalry. And I quote from the report, the US as a choice dropped from 61.61% in the previous year to 49.5%. Close to half of the respondents believe that ASEAN should enhance its resilience and unity to fend off pressures from the two major powers. And I think this is significant because this is no longer the competition or the zero-sum game that the ASEAN has to choose between the US or China. I think the emergence of multipolar world gives ASEAN another choice to stick together and to figure a way out of the dilemma. So I think these efforts, what China has been doing, enhancing its cooperation through the multilateral frameworks with its regional countries, show that Beijing's desire to become a leader on the global stage, that's for sure. However, I think it faces challenges from a more assertive US foreign policy and the strengthening of Western alliances, as we can see from what is happening in the South China Sea. The US and Canadian, Australian navies are sending their navies into the South China Sea to show, also showing support for Philippines. So I think to conclude, in this multipolar world, China's influence is shaped by its ability to adapt to both internal and external pressures. And the question isn't just about global reach. It's also about how it manages these challenges at home. China's ability to maintain its position will depend on how well it navigates a landscape of competing interests and evolving power dynamics. And especially with the interesting statement coming from James earlier, the idea of unipolar Asia, multipolar world, or, this is, I think we are seeing or understanding China, interpreting China from different lenses. It varies from the American lens, Indian lens, or the lens of China itself. So intention matters in a multipolar world, and it's very important that we reach consensus on a common language that is being used to explain the grammar of international relations and the international system today that we are seeing that is constantly evolving. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, very much for that. Can you tell me the competing interest dynamics of the multipolar world that you just outlined? Is that better or worse for China's expansion, growth, influence than dealing with the US predominant dynamics?
I think for China, it could go both ways. Because as Kerry sorry?
What's your instinct?
As Kerry pointed out earlier, China is an opportunistic state. So if we see from how China reacts in handling a lot of the disputes with the regional countries, especially in the South China Sea, there was a sense of caution and also assertiveness. So we get both kind of cautious avoidance of escalation of the conflict, the confrontation, but also we get the kind of non-compromising stance from China. But in this calculation, as I mentioned in my remarks, the United States and its allies, the presence of its security allies in the region has been a constant reminder to Beijing that how Beijing acts could trickle down to a broader context that goes beyond just regional influence.
Could I just get a definition, want a better word of you, because of your knowledge of the South China Sea, the rules-based international order and the China's building of the military bases in the South China Sea is often slated as a breaking of that international order, and that is illegal, and there have been court rulings against it and everything. Given what has been happening in Israel and Gaza, Ukraine, and the paralysis of the United Nations Security Council, which is meant to oversee all this, what has happened to this concept of international law in the past few years, and how do you think that will unfold?
Thank you. Interestingly, in the South China Sea, and I was actually in Manila earlier last month attending a conference, and it wasn't just China that has been criticized on the artificial island building. It was also Vietnam, who were also being criticized regarding the artificial island building. And in terms of international law, we know that UNCLOS has been ratified by most of the countries except for the United States. And also international law is subject for interpretation as well. And in the case of China, I think there is a shift from ambiguity to more clarity in terms of South China Sea policy tactics. It has been consistent. However, it was more clarity that it has been trying to reassert its claims through, the baseline demarcation announcements surrounding the Scarborough Shoal, and we are seeing the PLA Navy exercising surrounding the Scarborough Shoal in the last 2 weeks.
Is it the international law as the baseline for the discussion now, or is it the gunboats and who's got the most bullets in their barrels?
International law is always the baseline, but however, there is also different interpretation of how international law is to be interpreted.
And has that been weakened in recent years because not just the South, but of other events where international law has been broken so openly?
I don't think so. I think the ASEAN and China has always been pushing towards the code of conduct, pushing forward the same kind of conduct in the South China Sea. There has been continuing diplomatic negotiations and communications going on surrounding how we could.
It's still highly relevant. This is the point, that international law is still highly relevant. Thank you so much, Sophie. We will be coming back to you, but we are going to swing our spotlight now from the South China Sea and Southeast Asia to Eurasia. Dr. Mher Sahakyan is a Fulbright visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins University and the founder of the China-Eurasia Council for Political and Strategic Research. He's the editor of 2 recent works, China and Eurasian Powers in a Multipolar World Order 2, Security, Diplomacy, Economy and Cyberspace, and the Routledge Handbook of Chinese and Eurasian International Relations. So with our new unfolding world order, how is China faring in Eurasia? Mher Sahakyan, shine that spotlight for us.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and special thanks go to Lord Bruce for this invitation. I am very happy to be in this panel. And I think that the world order is no longer unipolar. What now exists should be called the Multipolar World Order 2.0, a new stage which has started after the beginning of non-direct war between Russia and NATO for the Ukraine. There are 2 superpowers now in Russia, US and China, 3 great powers, Russia, the UK and EU, and 1 big power, India. Middle powers such as Turkey and Iran also play an important role. Even small powers, North Korea is playing some games. Therefore, it means that the Eurasian continent is currently in the multipolar 2.0 stage and has multiple centers. In this multipolar world order 2.0, the great powers will contend across the Eurasian supercontinent regions, primarily for the South and East Asia, Central Asia, South Caucasus. We now see what is happening in Georgia. The Middle East, we have now a situation in Syria where Russia, Iran, Turkey, the US, and many other powers, Israel, are playing their games and these countries as a battlefield. And this competition will be even in Central and Eastern Europe. You were speaking about international law. I think it is dead. The rules and legalities will play a secondary role, with economic, political, and military capabilities of states playing the decisive role. This tough competition between the rival great powers asserting their spheres of influence will entail weaponized sanctions to secure technologies and exclude the opponents from the access to markets, restrictions on financial activities, and battles for influence in international organizations, or even starting new organizations. Now we see that Turkey started this the organization which is trying to unite all Turkic states. And the other thing, China is, if the Belt and Road Initiative Chinese side was saying that it is just an initiative, now we can see the last time during Belt and Road Forum, Chinese president mentioned about that it is time to make it as an institution. But what is doing this multipolar world order, as I like to say 2.0, the fact that we have some differences with the other multipolar world orders, because, as I have mentioned now, even middle and small states are playing decisive role. We have also another thing which we haven't till now. It is cyberspace, which will be another battlefield where great and middle powers will compete. And the technologies are standing very crucial. We can see that the US and China are leading in the high technology sphere, while we have other powers also, such as Japan, South Korea, the EU, India, and Russia, which are playing a crucial role. These powers struggle for high technology markets in different regions of the Eurasian continent is ongoing. The main competitors are China and the US in several spheres, such as production of digital data and development of artificial intelligence. China is playing leading role. In turn, the US is leading in the design and production of semiconductors and chips. These technologies are crucial in today's civilian and military production sectors. China also still heavily relies on, for instance, for Microsoft Windows operating system. There is some interdependence now, but as we see, the US and China are trying to cut this interdependence, which is standing another big problem for the world. In turn, the EU, South Korea, and Japan have a history of making high-quality technologies. In turn, Russia, if it has high technologies in military sphere, it has not in daily life, but it is now trying to some kind of finance its state companies, enterprises that they have also, by the help of China, Huawei, solved this problem. But we see that even we have new player in this high technology field as well. I want to speak about rising big power India, which is already among the world's largest suppliers of IT products and services. Having capabilities also because of its population, more than 1.4 billion, India has a capability to produce big data and also use it in artificial intelligence, which will bring it new opportunities. India also knows its capabilities, its ambitions when it successfully landed Chandrayaan-3 spacecraft on the moon surface. Therefore, the high technology sphere, which plays a crucial role in the 21st century, is also standing multipolar. We can see this multipolar moment also in financial sphere, because the financial sphere is also showing what is happening in the world. However, of course, the dollar will remain the strongest, taking into consideration that it is the currency of the first economy, and oil trade is also mostly going with it. Euro and pound will keep their position, but we see that yuan and ruble also emerging because, for instance, Iraq and others Middle Eastern states. They are starting to sell their oil to China, energy sources to China using yuan. And we can see that the oil trade and gas trade between Russia and China, it is also going on using ruble and yuan. But of course, there is a need to mention that India also trying to play this game, and it is starting to have its trade also with Russia using its own currency, rupee, and with China, they are also using their own currency. So therefore, in some, we can see that this multipolarity is emerging, and it is existing in financial sphere as well. And the last point which I want to make, I want to mention also about the Russian weapons production. Of course, war in Ukraine proved that weapons which are being produced in the US, in France, in Germany, they are very resultative. But we can also mention that Russian weapons are also resultative, and they are some kind of using this against NATO weapons, and they are working. And the other moment, which is very interesting, and even maybe it was a great surprise for all of us, the fact that Russia is buying drones from Iran. Iran is standing one of the big arms supplier, but not just some contemporary weapons, but high technology weapons, which is crucial to mention. And even if we had some kind of traditional weapon suppliers some 10, 20 years ago, which were US, Russia, UK, Germany, and other mostly Western countries. Okay, let's say also China. But now we can see that our states are also joining this group, making this weapons production moment multipolar. And they are not just what I want to say, sending some kind of weapons, primitive weapons, but they are exporting sophisticated high-tech weapons. And these states which joined newly, we can see Turkey, Israel, and also India. Thank you.
You just, in the Eurasian region, which are the nations or the governments that are significant there, and what is their view of this?
When I'm saying Eurasia, I mean continent, not just region. But if you want that we speak about post-Soviet Eurasia, if you mean South Caucasus and Central Asia, we have multipolarity here as well. And many different players are playing. For instance, the US is very active in the events which are happening in Georgia, but Russia is also very active. Armenia is trying to pivot towards the US, but no one is waiting Armenia in the West. So some kind of things are happening, and we can see also Turkey, which is trying to take the previous hegemon's role, Russia, because now Russia is not, because of the Nagorno-Karabakh moment and Russo-Ukrainian war, of course, it is losing its some kind of hegemonic role in the South Caucasus and Central Asia, and Turkey is coming forward. Iran is also trying to play its game. In some, how regional states, governments are looking on which is happening, it is different. Every state is trying to play its game and try to play with others, but it is very hard because of these small states, they are having less opportunities to maneuver, because some great powers, they are just saying you are with us or against us.
But a nation, say like Kazakhstan, is that equivalent to say Indonesia or something? Is saying we don't want that with us or against us?
Of course, no one wants this. Not only Kazakhstan. Why only Kazakhstan? No any country wants this, but it is what is happening. It is what is happening. And you have spoken about Kazakhstan, but let's go back 2 years ago, what was happening in Kazakhstan. Yeah. And just Russia and Collective Security Treaty Organization rescued Kazakhstan. So we need to think about this as well. What we are speaking, it is one thing, but the other thing, what is in reality, it is totally different thing.
And is it likely that this area becomes friction between China and Russia, who've got this, forever partnership at the moment?
They are trying. They have chosen cooperation over competition for Central Asia. They are trying to block it in an effective way that the US could not work there. And they could even, let's say, do their best that the US withdraw its military bases from Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. And for this, they are also using Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But we now see this Turkic states organization led by Turkey, which is trying to go from South Caucasus to Central Asia. And if the Turkish influence is going, the West influence.
So this really is you really have painted a multipolar picture there. But can I just ask you one last question? Is this authoritarian group that's talked about in Washington and London of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, is that a reality? And is that an example of a multipolar competition?
We cannot say that these powers like Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, they are very allied and they are one. It is not like this. I think they have cooperation in some spheres, interest in some spheres, but also contradictions. And they are even have some kind of competition in some regions. Of course, they are now working together, but there are moments that there are disagreements. For instance, I do believe that China was against that Russia started this war in Ukraine. Why? Because of China's trading nation. Its Belt and Road Initiative's new Eurasian land bridge goes from Europe towards Europe, from Russia, from Ukraine, from Belarus. So for now, this bridge is having problem, and Chinese investment in Ukraine in these territories is having problem. So I do not believe that in this they have a great agreement.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to open it up. We've got a question in that I'm going to throw out there. We have touched on it before, but it opens up the debate again. I'll start with Kerry. This is from Amit Rana. Would multipolarity be a more equal and benign management of power and influence among states, or would nations such as China and Russia simply become the new hegemons, replacing the US? Kerry?
I can't really see a world where Russia would be able to replace anyone, to be absolutely honest with you. I mean, its economy is a sixth the size of China's. No. I mean, it's a nuclear power. It's a significant power, but I don't think that it's going to have any future dominance.
And China avoids responsibility, as you say. So
yeah, it would be a big accident. It would be a huge geopolitical accident if that were to happen, because I don't think China would. I mean, here's the quandary: you have a power with very different worldview and values to most others, even its neighbors. We've just been referring to how hard it is for China to relate to even its neighbors, where there's maybe more things they have in common and have to talk about. So that would be a very, very different world to the world we live in now. And I can't see it coming about in the next few decades, if at all.
Yeah, and as Lord Bruce said at the beginning, I mean, we in the West have got a myriad of sophisticated written relationships with each other and treaties and God knows what, but China has none of that. That's significant. I mean, if you want to run the world, you need those relationships, don't you?
You do, and I think Sophie was sort of alluding to the fact that, kind of international law gives a basis, and China, well, there's many problems. I mean, there's many things where it's obviously interpreting things in a very different way, but we have that as a basis. It's not like China has completely walked away from the acceptance that there needs to be rules of engagement. It just disagrees with how they're interpreted, and that's a significant thing. But it's not saying there should be, one rule for us, one rule for them, no common rules. It's just saying there should be different kinds of rules.
Thank you. James, I want to move from that into Southeast Asia itself and the multipolarity that's come out there. I mean, Vietnam, I think, has recently hosted Joe Biden, Xi Jinping and Putin all within months of each other. Indonesia's new president has gone off to both Washington and Beijing. And this sort of thing, is that now acceptable in Washington? Is that a new reality for them?
So I think you have a division within Southeast Asia where you have one country, namely the Philippines, which over the last few years has drawn much closer to the United States, albeit with some questions as to whether it might at some point swing back the other way.
Could be an election, couldn't there? And it would just switch back again.
Exactly. All the other countries in Southeast Asia are in one form or another engaged in a form of delicate balancing between the two great powers. And Vietnam is the most precise of these, as in, it has a very careful calibration. It will sign a special new strategic partnership with the United States, but it will make sure that it will balance that with trips to Beijing and other kinds of agreements. Is there less tolerance for this in Washington? I think under Trump, yes. I think the Biden administration had quite a benign approach to the line was, we don't want to make you choose, we want to give you options. But if you think about areas like artificial intelligence, I think that the United States might look at Southeast Asian countries and think, well, if you really are going to play both sides of this and try to be friendly with China as well as with us, then we're simply not going to give you access to the crown jewels of our AI system. You saw that in the Middle East recently, where G42, the Emirati AI company, which had previously had partnerships with China, got out of all of its Chinese relationships and got into bed with Microsoft because it realized that if it wanted to have access to the most advanced AI, which is presently with the United States, it couldn't do that if it was trying to play both sides of the aisle. So I think as the US increases its strategic competition with Beijing, there will be less tolerance for countries sort of havering on both sides. But whether they will actually go out of their way to try and coerce a country like Malaysia to do less with China, I have my doubts. I mean, I think they have a pretty clear strategy in terms of how they want to deal with China, which is to focus on the core allies and partners, and so mostly I think they'll just spend less attention on those countries that are not willing to help in that regard.
So, Sophie, is it? Are we now into a totally transactional world, or do the values that the West has been at wars with for the past, God knows how long, on democracy and human rights, do they still prevail? And if so, how much?
I think, first of all, China has a different, Beijing has a very different definition or interpretation on how democracy and would mean in Chinese context comparing to the English context dominated by the US and other liberal powers. But I think we share the common consensus that we care for the crisis that is happening around the world. We care about the people in Gaza. We care about the people who are suffering in Ukraine. So I think that is the common basis that we share, that we care for what is going wrong in the world right now. And that is the basic consensus that everyone shares right now, I think.
So I just want to bring James back in for a second here. So James, is that a changed priorities there? Whereas we heard, a few years back, a Western leader would go to China and lecture them about human rights and democracy or any other country. Has that now changed?
I think it depends. I think you will find that a State Department led by Marco Rubio will be quite strong on criticizing China on human rights. On the other hand, for instance, you've seen...
Will that do any good?
Both the United States and the European countries actually have certainly stopped talking about human rights when they go and see India, as in ultimately they realize that what matters here is geopolitical influence, and India is a country that both the United States and Europe want to draw closer to for economic and strategic reasons, and the Indians used to be driven mad by preachy Europeans coming over and talking to them about human rights, and they basically stopped doing it. So I think in a way that will incite accusations of Western hypocrisy, the West will talk about human rights when it suits it, and not all of the rest of the time.
Mher, Is that a changed situation? In the West is not flying its flags of values of democracy in that than what was happening before?
I don't know, but I do not have great belief after what is happening in the world and what was happened in Nagorno-Karabakh. You know that people who were living there thousands of years just ousted there after the being in Hungary situation in isolation for more than 1 year. So, and no one is paying on this any attention. And this moment is bringing new opinion and thinking that there is no human rights, democracy, and it is being used only in occasion when it is about geopolitics.
Right. So, Kerry, moving forward, if there is this difference that we're about interpretation of human rights and democracy, you've been a diplomat in Beijing and lived through all that. Will that mean some sort of rewriting or re-understanding of the world order?
Yeah, I mean, I think the quandary we have at the moment is that, first of all, I suppose that the Chinese and others can say that the West may kind of preach all it wants, but does it live up to what it preaches? I mean, you know, our behavior in the last 20 years has been very strange. I mean, the war on terror, where basically the United States said, we don't need the UN, we're going to go in for it was the second Iraq war. You know, it kind of disregarded international law. It then, in Afghanistan, spent, $1 trillion and then had to withdraw in a shambles a few years ago. We've not been a great model, and our domestic politics has also been very, very messy. It's not to denigrate the values of democracy and liberalism, but to say that we definitely need to live up to those values a bit better if we want to kind of start preaching to others. On top of that, I mean, China and others have values that they feel that they can represent and that they hold by, and they have intellectual traditions that are important to know about. And the West isn't very knowledgeable about those. So, I mean, it's really a problem if you kind of, first of all, don't have a good basis on which to preach because of your own behavior. And if you then don't really know who you're preaching to because you've not really worked out what their worldview is that you can appeal to, you end up with this kind of cognitive dissonance we've got at the moment. If we believe in democracy and the values of democracy, and they are highly laudable and highly, you know, kind of praiseworthy, we have to behave in a different way. Behavior is the absolute key thing.
Yeah, and we're not. Mher, does that resonate with you in your world order too that you've written about? That there will have to be a certain rewriting of this world order and what our values are.
Of course, you know, it is about also the behavior of great states, superpowers, great powers. So mostly they are the light is coming always from the strongest. But as we see, there are some powers which are standing much more powerful and trying to take some regions, and these powers are not about democracy and human rights. So the situation is not so good, and I think that this multipolar world order 2.0 will bring us new wars, new catastrophes, and I hope that we will not have some kind of nuclear war as well. So it is very hard.
And just to repeat what you said earlier, in your view, the United Nations Charter on Human Rights and the other things, all the Bretton Woods stuff after the Second World War and international law, that's dead, is it? And now we're working through something new?
Yeah, sure. The problem is that it is not working. It is not working, and we have these problems. So I think that it must be rewritten and must be some kind of changes according to what we have. But I think that what we have now, this multipolar 2.0, it will not last for a long time, maybe 15 years, 20 years. But I hope that during this time, we will not kill each other.
Okay, I just want to come back to you with the main question of the debate and then go back to everybody else, ending with Kerry, to try to nail down your views and the debate's views. Does China's influence diminish in a multipolar world? And let's add to that, does China's influence expand in a multipolar world? Mher, is it expanding or diminishing?
I think both. I think it is expanding because China is getting some opportunity to work for its Belt and Road Initiative, to involve new states on this. and to find new markets. But on the other hand, as India, as in this multipolar world order, there are some powers which are contradicts with China, and for this reason, there is some kind of diminishing the power of China as well. And it is also step by step, it is losing its markets in the West. So it cannot be good for China.
So overall, it's not good for China.
Good and bad, both.
A little bit both, but prevailing is not good. I try to nail a yes or no answer at the end of these things. Sophie, what is your view? Diminished or expanded in a multipolar world?
I think my answer is also yes and no. In terms of diminished, we can see that the closer ties drawn between DPRK and Russia has been drawing concerns over Beijing of what is DPRK getting in return from the troops being sent to the Ukraine front line. But is it China that having a looser hand over its regional control? But on the other hand, we're also seeing more countries thinking about joining BRICS Plus and other initiatives that are initiated by China. We're seeing the multilateral cooperation and not just bilateral, trilateral, or even under the forecast symposium framework, China bringing the African continent together in Beijing. The zero tariff, it could go both ways. So I do think there is a definite answer on whether China's influence would diminish or expand in the multipolar world. I think militarily, there is definitely an expansionist kind of factor because China's military strength is growing. But culturally and socio-economically, I think there are a lot more to explore.
I just want to nail you down a little bit more on that because you're very balanced. I don't know if there's any one that prevails there, but is China better off in a multipolar world or in a dual polar world, as in US and China? Which is best for it?
Multipolar world, because China has been a beneficiary of the multipolar world starting from the day it joins WTO.
Yes. Okay, thank you. So that's better off. Mher says it's probably not. James Crabtree.
I don't think it does, no. I mean, and I answer it for a particular reason, which is that in this stage of multipolarity, which is, as our panelists have said, a multipolarity in which China and the US remain streets above everybody else in terms of overall power, then although there will be lots of disturbances in the world, the central contest remains the contest between the United States and China in East Asia. And therefore, China's influence over that system is going to be ever more central. I mean, its economy might be growing slightly more slowly, but from a high base. But I think its military is going to grow stronger. Its diplomatic influence is going to increase. And the relative losers of this are going to be the influence of the West. So I think there may be a future, many decades hence, in which India, Indonesia, Brazil, African nations all rise, and therefore China's relative slice of the influence pie, or however you care to think about this, does decline relatively. But I think we're quite a long way out from that yet. The story of the world that is to come is still fundamentally a story about the contest between the United States and China, and therefore China's role and influence within that system is going to increase for a good while yet.
And so the multipolar world benefits China, and it's better off in this world than it is if it was just the two powers and everybody else subservient to them.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that, Humphrey. I suppose so. I mean, certainly better to be in a sense, this two-power world that you're positing has been a creation of the last 5 years, right? So if we're junking that already and saying that that's over, I mean, I'm not sure that it is. I think that you have a world with many poles and two very large poles, and that's going to be true for quite a long time. And I think that's reasonably good for China. I think certainly better than what preceded it, which is a situation in which you had, one hyperpower and China nipping at its heels. So yes, I think China will see scope for both to have more influence within the existing system and to build new coalitions and institutions as it has with the BRICS.
Yes, of course. And talking about coalitions and institutions, of course, we must remember that technically speaking, NATO, the European Union, other things are part of a multipolar world led by the United States. So, Kerry Brown, you started us, so finish us. Is China going to diminish or expand in a multipolar world?
Okay. Well, look, I've really enjoyed talking to you all, and I've always learned a great deal from James and Sophie and the other participants. So thank you very much. Look, I mean, I guess we're creatures of the Enlightenment, all of us, whether we like it or not, wherever we are, and therefore we should be able to handle pluralism. And a pluralistic world order is not a bad one. I mean, that's not multipolar necessarily, but multipolarity is a form of pluralism. I think it's a bit weird that, Enlightenment characters like us and Europeans and Americans are sort of finding it so uncomfortable to deal with a new player coming along and representing different things. So I think we need to live up to one value, at least, our Enlightenment commitment to pluralism. So a multipolar system seems to me a pluralistic, good outcome. Secondly, I think China's influence is going to increase whether we like it or not. We are playing defensively. The West is playing defensively. Those who follow soccer will know, the English experience in the English team, whenever we kind of have a draw and we try and defend it, we end up losing, right? And I feel like now we're like football players who are defending a draw, right? We're defending a draw and we're trying to kind of play defensively. Our policy is very defensive. If you look 15 years ago, we're all about, bringing about legal, civil society, positive change in China. That was the EU's position, China's, America's position, Britain's position. And now it's about protecting ourselves, getting paranoid, protecting ourselves against the malign influence of China, getting very, very kind of, unsettled by this. That is a defensive position, and a defensive position in diplomacy is always a weak position. I think, therefore, that we're just going to have to accept a very, very different kind of world order and think nimbly about that. How we think more offensively, I don't really know, but we're going to have to do it. We are on the back foot now, and I think that implies that there is a huge tectonic change going. And finally, one thing that you do know about Mr. Trump, if he's obsessed by you, you matter. There's only one planet, one place on this planet apart from America he's obsessed by, and that's America. And there's only one person he seems to be obsessed by and says consistently nice things about, and that is, what were his words? The handsome Mr. Xi Jinping.
Kerry, thank you very much. It seems that the conclusion is that the jury is out. China is not going to diminish. It is going to generally favor a multipolar world, and much in between. But thank you, everybody, for bringing that to us. What a great debate we have had. Thank you, Lord Bruce and the Democracy Forum team, for bringing the panelists here, to Kerry Brown, James Crabtree, Sophie Wushuang and Mher Sahakyan. And our conclusion is that China's influence does not diminish. It is going to slowly grow. Keep an eye open for the next Democracy Forum debate in 2025 and for our sister magazine, Asian Affairs, which looks at issues that the mainstream media does not cover. But until then, from all of us at the Democracy Forum, thank you for being here, and goodbye.
Thank you.
What?